Forget our nation's history. What about our nation right now? The country's falling apart. People are losing their homes. They can't find work. You talk about ignorance. You're the ignorant ones, both of you. Why? You've ignored the voice of the people.
Well, the voice of the people, there is no such thing. You got 240 million voices all yelling for something different. The only thing you all seem to agree on is you don't want higher taxes. The voice of the people, my fanny.
I wanted to set the tone for this discussion with a line from the 1996 film My Fellow Americans. You heard a frustrated citizen yelling, "You've ignored the voice of the people." And then you heard a fictional former president, played by Jack Lemmon, fire back, "At the voice of the people, there's no such thing. You've got 240 million voices all yelling for something different." That exchange is the perfect way to frame the challenge we're wrestling with today. Public opinion isn't steady or predictable. It's a restless, living thing. It shifts with the tides of media spin, the words of political leaders, the health of the economy, and the identities and experiences we each carry. It's a force that can be measured, analyzed, even forecasted, but never fully pinned down. And yet, despite all its noise and contradictions, public opinion shapes our politics. It bends policy decisions and determines who leads and who loses power. Let's talk about how we try to capture the wild chorus of voices and make sense of the clashing notes and blended harmonies among the American public. Public opinion is the heartbeat of democracy. Politicians fear it, pollsters chase it, and media outlets twist it into headlines that sway entire elections. But this isn't a static thing. Public opinion moves, sometimes in ripples, sometimes in tidal waves, and we're here to learn how to track it without getting swept away. Public opinion is the collective voice of millions, and it's as complicated as it sounds. It's a mashup of attitudes, beliefs, instincts, and reactions to everything from war and peace to taxes and TikTok bans. We measure it through polls and surveys, trying to turn chaos into numbers. Done well, these polls give us a snapshot of the public's mood. Done poorly, they're nothing more than noise pretending to be insight. Since we can't ask every single person, imagine trying to measure public opinion across the state of Texas. With nearly 30 million people, you're not knocking on every door. Instead, you take a smaller group, sample, that reflects Texas's full diversity. You need urban and rural, young and old, different races, ideologies, and incomes. If that sample mirrors the state well, you've got a window into how Texans as a whole are thinking. But if you only talk to one city or one demographic, you'll miss the real story. Good polling means capturing that full mosaic so that the few voices you hear can stand in for millions. To get any sample right, two things have to happen: randomness and representativeness. Random sampling ensures that whether you're in Houston, Lubbock, El Paso, or a tiny panhandle town, you've got an equal shot of being chosen to participate. Representative sampling makes sure that that mix actually looks like Texas, from oil workers to tech employees, cattle ranchers to Austin musicians. Miss either one, and you're not measuring the state's public opinion. You're measuring a narrow slice of it. One of the most famous cautionary tales about sampling bias comes from the 1936 presidential election. The Literary Digest, a well-regarded magazine at the time, conducted what was then the largest political poll in history, mailing millions of surveys and collecting millions of responses. With numbers that massive, they were sure they had it right. They predicted Republican Alf Landon would crush Franklin Delano Roosevelt in a landslide. They couldn't have been more wrong. Roosevelt won in a historic blowout. What happened was sampling bias. The magazine pulled names from phone books, car registrations, and their own subscription lists, sources that during the Great Depression skewed toward wealthier Americans. Poorer voters who overwhelmingly backed Roosevelt were underrepresented. Even with millions of responses, a bad sample led to a catastrophically wrong prediction. This is why scientific sampling, not just big numbers, is essential to accurately capturing public opinion.
Nearly a month has passed since Election Day, when more than 150 million people across the country voted in the presidential race. And now that nearly all the ballots of the 2024 election have been counted, we do have a clearer picture of the accuracy of the polls, both national and battleground polls during this cycle.
Yeah, according to the Pew Research Center, this year's national polls turned in one of the best performances in presidential polling in decades. But this morning, we're taking a look at what those polls got right and where they might have missed the mark. We've got NBC News senior political editor Mark Murray joining us with more on all this. Mark, good morning. Always great to have you with us.
So let's start with what the polls got right. You now say that beyond signaling that the 2024 presidential election was competitive and uncertain, the polls nailed the political atmospherics that shaped the contest. So let's look at that. The final NBC News polls had President-elect Trump, Vice President Harris in a dead heat race right up till Election Day, like so many other polls. About a month later, what do we know?
Yeah, Joe, the polls got more right than they ended up getting wrong. And you ended up looking at our own final national NBC News poll that showed a tied race between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris at 49% each. The real clear averages nationally were in that same ballpark. And again, the final result, Donald Trump was a little bit more than that. Kamala Harris was a little bit less. But given a lot of the past misses that we've seen in presidential elections, particularly going back to 2020, this was a much better performance for the polls. And is also mentioned, the atmospherics got right. President Biden was unpopular. You ended up having a super majority of the country who think that the nation was headed in the wrong direction. Those were some of the big, broad stories that the polls were telling before the election, and that turned out to be the case.
Mark, now let's talk about the opposite and kind of two things here, where polls did get things wrong, but then also what factors lead to sort of like the perception that polls were wrong.
Yeah. So, Savannah, as I mentioned earlier, once again, Donald Trump's support was a little understated, certainly not as what we ended up seeing in 2020 and 2016, but he ended up outperforming his polls. But to me, and when we look at our own NBC News poll, maybe the biggest miss was that size of the overall gender gap. We were talking about a historic gender gap, and what it turned out to be was this was kind of almost the same gender gap that we've seen in past presidential contests in 2016 and 2020. Now, where there was a gender gap was when you end up adding education to that, college degrees, and that's where we ended up seeing a wide educational gap between men without college degrees and women with them.
So, Mark, if there's one number that explains why we saw what we saw, I think it's this. The NBC News exit poll found 73% of voters say that they were either angry or dissatisfied with the country's direction. Mr. Trump swept the battleground states, winning all 7. Felt like a surprise at the time, but that persistent dissatisfaction, that was key in the final result, right?
Yeah, Joe, I actually think that was the whole ball game. And, usually you end up having a president winning re-election or a presidential administration winning re-election when people say, hey, you know what? Good times are here again. It's morning in America. Things are on the right track or at least are getting better, like what we saw for Barack Obama in 2012. But with 73% of voters saying that the country, that they thought the country was heading in the wrong direction and they were dissatisfied, made it very difficult for Democrats to keep control control the White House.
Mark, for viewers who, just want to know more about how this all works, how we make these polls, what we'll do differently, how does this information impact and help poll gurus like yourself better prepare for the next round of election polling? Do any changes come after one of these?
Yeah, Savannah, one of the big lessons that we were telling at NBC News throughout this entire cycle was that polls aren't precise instruments. That if you get a number that says it's one candidate's at 50% and another candidate's at 49%, that one candidate at 50% isn't guaranteed to win. In fact, all that we know about that kind of result that it's close. And the polls did tell us about the atmosphere. They told us this was a very close and uncertain race. And that's kind of the extent to what polls can do.
Let's break down how sampling bias actually shows up in polling today. First, non-response bias. This is when a chunk of people just won't answer. In 2024, a lot of these folks leaned towards Trump and flat out ignored pollsters. That silence tilts results towards those more willing to chat with the surveyors, leaving entire swaths of opinion uncounted. Then there's social desirability bias. People say what they think sounds good instead of what they truly believe. Some voters will tell a pollster they support a safe, popular candidate, but once they're alone in the voting booth, they make a completely different choice. It's part human nature, part political pressure, and it scrambles polling accuracy. Finally, likely voter errors, and this one's big. Pollsters have to guess who's actually going to show up on election day. In 2024, those guesses were way off in some swing states. Independents came out in surprising numbers, throwing off projections. So even when pollsters reach the right mix of people, their models for who cast a ballot were stuck in 2020. Polls are never perfect. They're snapshots, not crystal balls. And that's because public opinion is fluid. It shifts depending on what's in the news, what's happening in the economy, or who's dominating the conversation online. Even the best polls, with careful sampling and weighting, can only estimate the mood of the electorate. They can't see the last-minute surge of independent voters or capture how undecided voters break in the voting booth. Polls are tools, useful ones. But if you treat them as flawless forecasts, you're setting yourself up for election night shock. Now, the margin of error is the honesty clause of polling. It's the pollster's way of saying, here's our best read, but we know we could be off by this much. If a poll shows candidate A ahead 49% to 47% with a plus or minus 3% margin of error, that's not a clear lead. That is a statistical tie. In 2024, we saw plenty of polls with slim margins treated as if they were conclusive wins. The media ran with narratives that ignored that plus minus 3% swing. Understanding margin of error means recognizing that these polls are ranges shaded with uncertainty. Don't miss that nuance. Sampling error is baked into every poll. Even with good sampling methods, a small group can only approximate the full electorate. The bigger the sample size, the smaller the error, because you're capturing more of the true political DNA of the whole population. National polls often use between 1,000 and 2,000 respondents for a plus or minus 3 error margin. Local polls with smaller samples can swing even wider, sometimes even more than 5%. Unless you ask every single voter, which of course is impossible, you're working with a managed level of uncertainty. Don't ever take a poll at face value. You have to always ask, who sponsored it? And do they have a political agenda? Is the sample truly representative of the population? Did they poll all registered voters, likely voters, or just adults? Were the questions fair or leading? What's the response rate? How many people they contacted actually answered? Every one of these factors can tilt results, and knowing them helps you cut through the spin and understand what the poll really says. Start with the money and motive. Poll sponsors can shape methodology or framing to suit their narrative. That doesn't automatically make the results wrong, but it should make you critical. Legitimate polling outfits will tell you who paid for the survey, how many people they asked, how they asked them, and the margin of error. If you can't find that information, treat the results like a campaign ad, not necessarily credible data. Next question. Does the sample look like the population it claims to represent? If a national poll is missing key demographics, say young voters, racial minorities, or rural residents, you're not seeing a full picture of public opinion. In 2024, some state polls skewed towards older voters, underestimating youth turnout and warping predictions. A representative sample is the foundation of trustworthy polling. Pollsters define their target group: registered voters, likely voters, or all adults, and that choice changes results. A poll of all adults might show broad support for an issue that doesn't translate into votes because many respondents aren't registered or don't plan to cast a ballot. In 2024, the difference between polling all adults versus actual likely voters shifted margins by several points in critical states. Always ask who's really being counted and who's showing up. Question wording can nudge people towards certain answers. For example, one poll once asked, "Do you support President Bush's measured decision to send additional troops to Iraq?" That wording frames support as the sensible choice. Another asked, "If it would result in increased opportunities for educating Texas citizens, would you favor building a new TV transmitter at Liberty Science Center?" This presents only one side of the issue, making it more likely respondents support it. A well-crafted poll uses neutral language and balanced information. When you see one-sided wording, assume the results are designed, not discovered. Loaded terms turn a poll into propaganda. For example, do you actually support this terrible politician? Or when did you stop stealing from your job? Or even, are you one of those hateful people that doesn't have any religious beliefs? These phrases presuppose negativity and pressure respondents into certain answers. Polls should not manipulate emotions. They're meant to measure them. When loaded terms sneak in, the data stops reflecting public opinion and starts manufacturing it. Here's another real-world example of a bad polling question. This poll asked, based on what you know, would you say that this indictment of Trump is politically motivated and without merit? This is a textbook double-barreled question. It forces respondents to give a single answer to two separate claims, whether it's politically motivated and whether it lacks merit. A respondent might believe one, but not the other. When pollsters lump multiple issues into one question like this, the answers lose clarity and accuracy. making the results ultimately unreliable. Response rate is the percentage of people contacted who complete the survey or answer the question. A higher response rate increases the likelihood that the sample is representative of the population. Low response rates can introduce non-response bias, meaning the poll ends up reflecting only the most willing respondents rather than everyone's opinion. Take this example. A poll once asked people if they would support bombing Agrabah, a fictional city from Disney's Aladdin. 30% supported bombing it, 13% opposed, and 57% weren't sure. This bizarre result highlights non-response bias. Many who might have clarified the absurdity of the question didn't respond at all. When large portions of people don't answer, poll results get skewed and fail to represent the broader population. And not every poll fits neatly with the rest. Take this Iowa poll example from the 2024 presidential election. Multiple final polls showed Trump ahead of Harris by a solid margin, but one poll bucked the trend, showing them tied. That single outlier hinted at a dramatic shift that didn't materialize. Trump ultimately won Iowa by over 13 points. Outliers should make you curious, not gullible. One poll that breaks from the pack could indicate flawed methodology or random variance. Always look for multiple polls confirming a trend before declaring a sudden change in public sentiment. And finally, who's doing the interpreting? What is their motive? Poll results don't speak for themselves. People spin them to fit their narratives. Look at these religious affiliation trends. One, the graph shows that Christians still make up over 60% of the U.S. population. And a pastor on Sunday morning might use that to celebrate a moral majority. But another person highlights the steep decline of Christian affiliation and the nearly 20-point rise in those claiming no religion at all, warning of an existential shift. Meanwhile, academics point to long-term projection, showing these lines possibly crossing by 2050, reframing the story entirely. The same data can sound like triumph, doom, or a slow cultural change, depending on who's telling the story. Public opinion polls work the same way. Numbers aren't neutral. They're filtered through human interpretation, political strategy, and sometimes outright spin. Always ask who benefits from the way poll results are being presented. National polls aim to measure attitudes, beliefs, or knowledge across the entire country. For example, this CBS News poll surveyed over 1,000 adults nationwide to gauge public concern about healthcare costs. These polls try to capture the national mood, but they can't tell you much about specific states or local trends. Benchmark polls are the starting gun for campaigns. When a candidate is deciding to run, they commission a benchmark poll to test their name recognition, see how voters feel about them versus their opponents, and identify which issues are resonating. It's the early data used to map campaign strategy and messaging. Tracking polls take repeated measurements over time to detect shifts in public opinion. For example, this Economist YouGov weekly tracker from early 2025 charted Donald Trump's job approval and disapproval over several months. It shows disapproval peaking at 55% in March and gradually declining toward June, while approval climbed slightly from 40% to 45%. Campaigns and analysts use this kind of data to see whether events, speeches, or controversies are shifting sentiment week by week. Tracking polls don't offer final answers, but reveal movement and momentum over time. Exit polls catch voters as they leave polling stations on Election Day. They ask who you voted for and why, as well as demographic questions. Exit polls help media organizations call races and later provide insight into voting patterns across gender, race, age, and more. They're invaluable for understanding the why behind election outcomes. Push polls are not real polls at all. They're political hit jobs dressed up as surveys. A well-known example occurred during the 2000 South Carolina Republican primary, where voters reported receiving calls asking if they'd be less likely to support John McCain if they knew he had fathered an illegitimate black child. This was not an actual poll. It was a smear tactic designed to damage McCain's campaign and benefit his opponent, George W. Bush. To set the record straight, McCain had adopted a daughter from Bangladesh with his wife, Cindy. There was no illegitimate child. The push poll twisted this fact into an inflammatory rumor aimed at triggering racist sentiments among voters. This case shows how push polls rely on spreading misinformation, emotional manipulation, and exploiting trust in legitimate polling practices. They're designed to influence public opinion, not measure it, turning a scientific tool into a weapon of political character assassination. Public opinion doesn't form in a vacuum. It's shaped by countless influences, from the people we know to the institutions we trust or distrust. Our earliest political teachers are usually our parents or guardians. Schools and teachers also play a big role, introducing civic values and political knowledge. Peers, friends, classmates, co-workers shape our views through conversation and debate. Churches, neighborhoods, and workplaces reinforce shared values, creating a foundation for our political outlook. These networks influence us long before we cast our first vote. Political socialization is the lifelong process of developing political beliefs. Social contact, living, working, and worshiping with people who share our views reinforces these beliefs. This is called homophily. Birds of a feather flock together. Social media has turbocharged this, creating echo chambers where people mainly interact with like-minded voices, further shaping and polarizing opinion.
Go to Google and type in "climate change is." You're going to see different results depending on where you live. In certain cities, you're going to see it autocomplete with "climate change is a hoax." In other cases, you're going to see climate change is causing the destruction of nature. And that's a function not of what the truth is about climate change, but about where you happen to be Googling from and the particular things that Google knows about your interests.
Even two friends who are so close to each other, who have almost the exact same set of friends, they think, I'm going to news feeds on Facebook, I'll see the exact same set of updates. But it's not like that at all. They see completely different worlds because they're based on these computers calculating what's perfect for each of them.
The way to think about it is it's 2.7 billion Truman shows. Each person has their own reality with their own facts.
Why do you think that Truman has never come close to discovering the true nature of his world until now?
We accept the reality of the world with which we're presented. It's as simple as that.
over time, you have the false sense that everyone agrees with you because everyone in your newsfeed sounds just like you. And that once you're in that state, it turns out you're easily manipulated. The same way you would be manipulated by a magician. Magician shows you a card trick and says, pick a card, any card. What you don't realize was that they've done a setup. So you pick the card they want you to pick. And that's how Facebook works. Facebook sits there and says, hey, you pick your friends, you pick the links that you follow. But that's all nonsense. Just like the magician, Facebook is in charge of your newsfeed.
We all simply are operating on a different set of facts. When that happens at scale, you're no longer able to reckon with or even consume information that contradicts with that worldview that you've created. That means we aren't actually being objective, constructive individuals.
And then you look over at the other side, and you start to think, how can those people be so stupid? Look at all of this information that I'm constantly seeing. How are they not seeing that same information? And the answer is, they're not seeing that same information.
What are Republicans like?
People that don't have a clue.
The Democrat Party is a crime syndicate, not a real political party.
A huge new Pew Research Center study of 10,000 American adults finds us more divided than ever, with personal and political polarization at a 20-year high.
You have more than a third of Republicans saying the Democratic Party is a threat to the nation, more than a quarter of Democrats saying the same thing about the Republicans.
Beyond people, other forces influence opinion. Self-interest is a powerful driver. People tend to support policies that benefit their wallets or personal circumstances. Partisanship and ideology also matter. Many Americans filter issues and candidates through their party allegiance, sometimes more strongly than through facts or policy details. This has reshaped where people live, where they work and socialize, contributing to today's sharp political divides. Americans are increasingly sorting themselves geographically by ideology and party. This isn't just a red state, blue state divide. As a matter of fact, it's more of a local splitting urban and rural areas divide. Dot density maps from 2016 and 2020 and 2024 show vast clusters of Democratic voters in cities and Republican voters dominating rural regions. People are moving into communities that reflect their political identities, which in turn strengthens partisan divides and makes compromise harder. Education plays a major role in shaping political engagement. The more formally educated a citizen is, the more likely they are to vote, stay politically informed, and participate at every level of the political system. They're also more likely to uphold democratic principles and political norms. For example, there's a notable political gulf between formally educated and non-educated white voters. Higher education levels among white voters have increasingly correlated with Democratic support, while non-college educated whites have swung heavily towards the Republicans. This split influences party strategies, campaign messaging, and ultimately election outcomes. Age, too, plays a key role in shaping political identity and behavior. Generally, younger voters have weaker ties to political parties than older generations. But it's not just about how old you are right now. It's about when you were young. This is where generational effects and the law of cohorts come in. Your political outlook is heavily influenced by the societal and political context during your formative years. The silent generation came of age during World War II and the early Cold War, baby boomers during the Civil Rights Movement and Vietnam, Gen X under Reagan and Watergate, millennials in the shadow of 9/11, and Gen Z during Trump's presidency and COVID-19. We can see these influences in voting trends. Data shows younger generations like millennials and Gen Z leaning more Democratic, while older generations trend more Republican. These patterns stem from the distinct events that shape their early understanding of politics and identity. Gender and marital status also shape political behavior and party support. The gender gap refers to differences between men and women in voting behavior, political views, and party affiliation. Historically, women have leaned more Democratic than men, creating a consistent gap in support for candidates and policies. Marriage further influences political behavior. Data shows a persistent marriage gap, with married voters often leaning more conservative compared to unmarried voters. Over time, these gaps have shifted in size, but remain significant factors in understanding electoral outcomes. From 2004 to 2024, the Democratic support consistently differed by both gender and marital status, shaping campaign strategies and election results. Race and ethnicity remain some of the strongest predictors of political preferences in the United States. This is shaped by socialization, community experiences, and deliberate party outreach efforts over decades. Looking at the data, Black voters have consistently supported Democratic candidates at high rates since the 1960s, often above 80%. Latino and Asian American voters also lean Democratic, though with more fluctuation over time. In contrast, white voters have leaned Republican in recent decades, with support levels staying above 55% in most elections. From 2018 to 2024, data show Democrats maintaining strong majorities among voters of color, while Republicans dominate among white voters. These trends reflect long-standing historical, cultural, and policy factors that shape political identity and party loyalty across racial and ethnic groups. Religious beliefs strongly influence political views and party affiliation in the United States. Different faith traditions emphasize different moral priorities, shaping stances on social issues, economic policy, and governance. Data from 2012 to 2024 show striking differences in Republican vote share by religious group. White evangelicals remain the most consistently Republican, with nearly 80% support. Mainline Protestants and Latino Protestants lean Republican at over 50% and 44%, respectively. Latino Catholics and Jewish voters show lower Republican support, around 30 and 25%. Black Protestants overwhelmingly support Democrats, with less than 10% voting Republican. Americans with no religious affiliation also lean Democratic, with under 30% voting Republican. These divides illustrate how religious identity acts as a powerful driver of political alignment, shaping party coalitions and policy debates in every election cycle. Public opinion can reshape reality. When enough people perceive a problem, politicians respond with policy solutions, even if the perception doesn't fully match the facts. Take crime in the 2020s. Despite FBI data showing overall violent crime rates declining from early pandemic highs, many Americans believe crime was skyrocketing. Media coverage of isolated incidents, viral social media videos, and political rhetoric amplified fear. This perception drove calls for tougher policing policies and influenced campaign messaging in cities and states nationwide. In short, the perception of rising crime, not the reality, helped dictate policy responses.
In the fall of 2022, we conducted 100 interviews in New York, Seattle, Chicago, Philadelphia.
Hannah Love, she researches cities and public safety at the Brookings Institution.
What we overwhelmingly heard from folks was fear of crime in downtown business districts.
It was 2 years into the pandemic, and in the middle of what felt like an explosion of American crime
spiking on the streets of cities across the country. Grapple with crime has increased.
Nationwide spike in violent crime
in the U.S. is rising.
Homicides increased by 36%.
But since then, the story has gotten a little more confusing. Sometimes the news says that crime is going down, but other times,
crime is turning cities into war zones.
FBI is underreporting
random acts of violence.
2/3 of Americans say crime in the U.S. is a very or extremely serious problem. And more than 3/4 of us say that there's more crime than a year ago. So, which is it? Crime up or crime down? And if it is down, what exactly do most Americans actually think is happening with crime?
Crime.
So my first question was, okay, when the news says that crime has decreased, where's that info coming from? I asked my colleague Abdullah.
My name is Abdullah Fayyad. I'm a policy correspondent at Vox. The two areas that we get our crime statistics from are the FBI crime database. Law enforcement agencies around the country voluntarily report their crime data. The other is the National Crime Victimization Survey, which is administered by the federal government and asks people directly whether or not they have been victims of a crime.
And both of these sources have their own limitations. The survey usually talks to around 250,000 people, which is both a lot of people and only about 0.07% of the country. And the FBI's data is by nature only made up of crimes that get reported to police. That's actually a big reason the FBI's data on homicide is one of the most widely studied and cited crime statistics, because murder is almost always reported. Now, right now, this chart ends in 2019. Add 2020, and we see murder spike.
There is a reason why people feel like crime is going up, because crime was going up.
But experts we talked to also recommended putting that spike into context of the way that things were before this, what sociologists and criminologists refer to as the great crime decline of the 90s. And if you extend the chart in the other direction too, all the way to 2023, that 2020 spike starts to look temporary. It's now falling. Not yet to where it was before the pandemic, but down. So that's homicide, but we can also look at the FBI's broader violent crime rate over that same period of time, which also looks like it's falling. The national property crime rate is a similar story. This doesn't mean that all crime is going down everywhere, but it does mean it's down in most places. And yet, 77% of us say the opposite is true. So let's look closer at that. The polling organization Gallup has actually been asking Americans this question for about 35 years, and their data on how people have answered it over that time gives us a clue on how to interpret it. Because it turns out, with the exception of 2 years, a majority of Americans have always said that crime is higher than it was last year.
What we're seeing is a consistent fear about crime, despite the fact that over the same period of time, crime had been steadily on the decline.
And it's also worth taking a similar look at this chart from earlier, where 2/3 of Americans say crime is a very or extremely serious problem in the US. We can also chart that over time and see that it is also a pretty consistent belief. But Gallup also asked another version of that question. How serious a problem is crime in your area? And only a small minority of Americans typically say that crime where they live is a very or extremely serious problem. In other words,
the vast majority of Americans feel safe, but there's this kind of abstract perception of crime is out of control.
Crime is out of control. But not where I am, but somewhere. That somewhere was partly the subject of Hannah's research interviews, many of which, remember, were about a specific fear in a specific place.
The fear of random acts of violence downtown.
Violent crime downtown, in the parts of cities where people go to work. Hannah and her team found that interesting because they also did a geographic analysis of where in cities crime was happening.
When we crunched the data, we found that there was a significant mismatch in perception and reality of crime, particularly as it pertains to where crime occurs.
In Chicago, for example, they found that most of the increase in gun deaths in 2020 happened in disadvantaged neighborhoods on the west, south, and southwest sides, and barely at all in the dense downtown Loop area. In New York, they found that in the busiest parts of the city, violent crime only increased about 2% from 2019 to 2022 compared to an 8% increase in the rest of the city.
Downtowns were not driving any sort of citywide increases in crime, even though people felt as though they were.
So even when violent crime was higher, it wasn't high where people thought it was high. But why did people think that? Hold on to that thought because slight tone change. This video is sponsored by BetterHelp. The U.S. election is just a few months away, which for a lot of people is stressful. It is important to stay informed, but it is also important to take care of yourself. And this month, while the stress of the fall is still kinda in the distance, is a good time to start. The way that BetterHelp works is that you fill out a brief questionnaire and you get matched with a licensed therapist, although you can also switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Take a moment, visit betterhelp.com/VoxVideo to get 10% off your first month. All right, so we were looking at this data that showed us that while people thought urban downtowns were really dangerous, they actually weren't. Now, one reason people thought that might have been media coverage.
Crime continues to concentrate within neighborhoods where it's always been bad. But community or everyday gun violence often doesn't make the headlines as much as something that would happen in a wealthier or more tourist-based district.
2 violent attacks in Times Square, 2 separate stabbings in Center City, 4 robberies that have happened downtown.
But Hannah found that the people she talked to weren't just seeing stuff on TV. They were also reacting to something they were seeing in person.
When we were doing our interviews, people often conflated crime and unsheltered homelessness within the same breath.
One thing that has changed a bit since the pandemic is in who you see on the streets in these downtown neighborhoods. Before the pandemic, that would be overwhelmingly office workers, some tourists, but there were also always some number of people on the streets experiencing homelessness, addiction, mental health issues. And then the pandemic emptied these places out, and as office workers and tourists slowly returned...
When there's less people crowding the streets, you're more likely to see things like visible homelessness or visible drug use.
Today, more of us are back in offices, but there are also, by some accounts, simply more vulnerable people on the streets, partly due to the cutting of social services. For example, by 2022, New York State had 20% fewer psychiatric beds for people with severe mental illness than it had in 2014. And from 2019 to 2023, the number of Americans experiencing unsheltered homelessness went up by more than 20%.
I live in Boston, where over the past few years, there has been a homeless encampment that does create this public perception that there is not just disorder, but chaos in how the city is running itself. Even if, those encampments don't necessarily pose, an imminent threat or danger to the residents that live in those areas.
Changes like these can make a city feel different, even less safe. But all the data we have tells us that equating vulnerable people with crime is not correct. And here's the problem with that.
If people don't feel safe, then we're not accomplishing our task. Stats don't matter if people don't believe they are in a safe environment.
What we're currently seeing right now is a lot of politicians and policymakers crafting policy based on perception rather than evidence.
The governor of New York sent the National Guard to patrol the New York City subway. Crime on the subway had already been on the decline.
That's an explicit example right there of having perception-based policy take a lot of municipal resources and taxpayer money without having any results because it's in the wrong place.
A lot of what we're seeing are counterproductive policy solutions to crime in the long term. Harsher penalties for petty crime that include eliminating eligibility for parole and probation. In San Francisco, voters imposed drug test requirements on welfare recipients. Tough on crime bills that we kind of felt like the country was moving away from, over the last 10, 15 years, and now are coming back in a very big way.
In a way, this is an impossible story to tell. Try telling the victim of an actual crime that crime is down. Try telling it to a country seeing real crimes on TV. Last time I'll show you this chart, and I want you to tell me which of the following two clips fits it better.
Last year, the murder rate saw the sharpest decrease in history. Violent crime fell to one of its lowest levels in more than 50 years.
The defund the police Democrats have turned our once great cities into cesspools of bloodshed and crime.
In April 2024, an ABC News poll found that voters trust Donald Trump over Joe Biden on crime and safety by a margin of 8 percentage points. I was honestly surprised it wasn't more than that. Imagine that the homicide rate kept falling like this, and that by 2025 or 2026, you saw it get to its lowest in decades. How many people would believe you?
Public opinion is alive, shifting, and often unpredictable. It's molded by education, age, race, religion, media, and personal experiences. Polls attempt to capture it, but every snapshot comes with blind spots and biases. Perception shapes reality, and in politics, perception often becomes policy. Understanding how public opinion forms, how it's measured, and how it influences decision-making is essential for navigating democracy. The more we grasp the forces shaping opinion, the better equipped we are to cut through spin, challenge misinformation, and make informed choices that reflect not just loud voices, but the true chorus of a diverse nation.